Thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope you all got now my handout, which may help you in following my lecture. I must say that I will most likely, I hope to publish a book on the Colonate with the Cambridge University Press, but it is still a bit too legal to the taste of the ancient historians. And one thing, and that is what I'm applying here, is a methodology. I start with the Colonate under Justinian, because we have for that period almost all the sources which might be available. And then I go, so to speak, backwards in time. And as you see, it is like a funnel. It slows down. The further we go back to the origin, the less text we have. But I think if we see the essentials as it is under Justinian, and then we have, let's say, as I hope to show in the lecture, at the end, just one text, then we may say, if that is the case, then there must be another. It is, if I may say, you all have seen CSI. They walk around and they find a hand, and then you know where there's a hand, there's a body. And of course, the body may be mutilated, but normal, we tell us, there must have been a human to the hand. He may have not have legs, but there must have been a body, and there must have been a heart, and there must have been a head. And that, in a way, in a nutshell, is the method I am going to apply. And I think that leads to more secure results than just starting with the earliest text and then imagining what would be around. So that is what I wanted to say, and that is what text 1 is about. Now about the Colonate. In legal and documentary sources from the 4th till 6th century, we meet people who are called coloni sensibus adscripti, originalis, originarii, often merely coloni, sometimes simply sensiti or adscriptitii, in Greek anapographoi or paoikoi. And it is clear from this text that they were subjected to another person, the owner of land, and that they, because of their attachment to the land, were subjected to this person. And this combination of attachment to an estate and subjection to its owner is called the colonate. And already in Antiquity, because we meet the term jus colonatus. But how this came about, or how exactly this constellation was legally fixed, is unclear. And there are various theories on this. But before mentioning these, if necessary, and suggest an explanation, which I certainly will do, it is necessary to focus first on the reality of life on the land in late antiquity. Agricultural life in the 6th century. For this we have a description which is excellently suited to our purpose. Sirks has analyzed the economic structure of the household of the Apiones, a wealthy family in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt in the 6th century. This means that he concentrated on the upper land-owning class. But we have to remember that next to these big households, often consisting of a number of small estates which were managed collectively, there were also many farmers, small landowners, who lived on and tried to live from their plot of land, or who were tenants or farmhands. The Apion property consisted of directly managed estates, leased village properties, and leased urban properties. And the management of these was done by overseers. An accounting system provided for the overall control. And that is really remarkable. It's a kind of gyro system, and in the bookkeeping, they keep track of everything. And the overseers issued the employed people credit notes as a payment for their work, which could be exchanged for small denomination money. And so we see that it was a highly monetarized economy. Amongst the village properties, there were hamlets, each run by a manager, frontistas, and these hamlets functioned as a kind of labor settlements from which the workforce necessary to cultivate the managed estates was recruited. Village properties were also leased to these people, and the revenues were in part used to support the managed estates. Next to all these people, there were slaves, of course, working on the managed estates. It appears that the people in the hamlets were not workless paupers, but on the contrary engaged in all kinds of economic and commercial activities. Yet they, or part of them, were also regularly summoned to work on the managed estates of the Apiones. Now, if these summons were based on a duty on their part, we may find here Coloni. They too will have received something as a payment. And next to these groups who were in one way or another linked to the Apiones, there were independent small farmers, and we should not exclude that they too tried to have a sideline by working occasionally for the Apiones. In short, everybody except the Apiones and their staff tried to scratch a living together. Now about agricultural life in the 3rd century. I have to approach the problem from one side and from another side. Well, this picture for the 6th century fits the situation which Rathbone has reconstructed for the middle of the 3rd century from the Heroninus archive for the estates of Apiones in the Fayum, north of Oxyrhynchus. And this is not so surprising, the reality of agricultural life remained the same in those centuries. It was a hard life. We see a mixture of agricultural aggregates of the rich who lease out, who hire day laborers, who have slaves, next to small independent farmers and farmhands. And this was not only in Egypt so. We do not have specific data for other areas except for a legal text from Gaul in the 4th century, text number 3. But the references to Coloni and to the rural life over the empire make it likely that it was like that everywhere. Natural disasters could befall Egypt and other regions and would bring farmers, whether they owned their plot themselves or rented it, to the brink of starvation and often already into debt. And in any case there was, as everywhere, next to death, the taxation. Everybody on the land had to pay the poll tax, the capitatio humana, which was levied per head. How was the poll tax and the colony in 529 AD? Text number 2. In this connection we find the colonate mentioned. In a large constitution of the year 529, Justinian sets out how this tax must be paid when the colony challenge in law that they are subjected to the colonate. They pay this tax either by themselves directly to the tax collectors, or they turn over to the estate owner the revenues of the land, who then pays it to the authorities. Since the latter implies tenancy or quasi-tenancy, the tax must have been the poll tax. Only if somebody owned land, he paid the land tax, and in person. Other taxes do not figure here. We see that there were 2 ways in which the colony were economically involved. If they were tenants, they could pay the tax out of the revenues, or borrow it from the landowner. Or they turned over the revenues, perhaps as a part of the revenues, and the landowner paid. If they were not tenants, the first form of paying the tax would imply that notwithstanding their independence as farmers or farmhands, they were bound as coloni to the estate owner, probably through an advance for taxes and other expenses. They could be coloni just as farmhands who contracted out their work could also be coloni, as we know from Gaul, text number 3, a text of 371. In this text, coloni migrate elsewhere and hire themselves out as free farmhands, earning by that money. They must return, but first pay their debts, namely as laid down in the estate accounting system. It is clear that this whole way of accounting for an estate was not only prevalent in Egypt, it must have been used everywhere where you had large aggregates of land. And then they have to pay the poll tax themselves. But if the estate owner knew they were fugitive coloni and used them without payment, he must pay the tax owed for them. He exploited them, of course. Apparently, the first estate owner did not have to do this now. And the colonus himself, we see, was liable in the first place for himself and his family. If present, we do even have the poll tax tariff. Justinian also prescribed that it did not suffice to prove the colonate by, for example, an acknowledgement or a document. There had to be an agreement and at least one supporting document, like the registration in the census of the estate. Otherwise, he says, text number 4, at the end, there would be the danger that free men were drawn into the worse condition of the colonate. The economic and social realities behind these rules fit Sarah's description of rural life. Now the essentials of the colonate under Justinian. We have them by now. A colonus was tied to an estate. He was subjected to the estate owner. He had to pay the poll tax, either by himself or through the estate owner. The tie to the estate was effected through the enrollment of the colonus in the declaration of the estate for the land tax. He entered it by agreement. He was registered, likely through an extract, adscriptio apographos, in the census declaration. Hence the expression censibus adscripti, and hence the terms adscriptitii or enapographoi. This registration entailed the subjection to the estate owner as owner, not as an individual person. Was that possible? In classical Roman law, it was indeed possible that a debtor was adjudicated by the magistrate to his creditor to pay off the debt by working for him. To that purpose, he was put into the power, mancipium, of the creditor. And this was the status of in mancipio esse. If the creditor died, the debtor probably came into the mancipium of the heir, just as with slaves, if he still had to work off his debt. According to Casa, this status was probably extinguished by the 4th century, perhaps in this form, but it may have continued in another form. But there's a difference too. The colonate was entered voluntarily, but if the estate changed owner, the new owner could exercise this power. Occupations of coloni. On the other hand, the colonus was a free man and not a slave. He could marry, he could own property, he could contract, he could in later times become a priest, and he was a taxpayer. And he didn't have to be a tax farmer. He could exercise other professions. Papyri of the 5th and 6th century, many of whom come from the Apion estate, in which mention is made of enapographoi Georgoi, that is coloni adscriptitii, provide ample proof that the reality of the colonate was diverse. They had duties but could combine these with various occupations, such as being stewards on the estate of the Apiones or on another estate, being a guard on a watchtower, being a fruit grower. One colonus sold wine. Coloni could collect public taxes under surety of their property, and this proves that they owned property of which they could dispose. That is text 5, second example. In another text, that's the text 5, number 1, an adscriptitius of the hamlet Monimu leases from his master Flavius Strategius land, which lays in another possession of the master. And here it shows that he was free to make a contract. Similar cases we find in other papyri, and there was evidently no conflict with the colonate obligations. Receipts provide us also with much information. Apollos and Petzisis were charged with the estate aggregator. The same charge we see executed by a number of other coloni. There is an adscriptitia, text 5, number 1. Aurelia Tarilla, who was in charge of an estate irrigator, needed to replace an axle, and the price of this was put down to her account. We even see that Coloni succeeded in entering the imperial service or provincial administration, but they are removed because it's incompatible with their status. They are subjected people. So the colonate status, yes, these examples show also that the colonate was in those days rather a status, a condicio coloniaria, as they say. Text 5, first text, shows that there are women who call themselves enapographos Georgos, without feminizing this noun. One could exercise all kinds of profession, but one remained bound to an estate and subjected. In a way, it resembles the later West European medieval villainry, Hörigkeit. It is understandable that this status has been characterized as a half-freedom, as an intermediate status between freedom and slavery. But that is wrong. The coloni were always free people. be it under the potestas of the estate owner. That is comparable to children in the potestas, and nobody would call a child in the potestas half free or half slaves. But there is of course a difference. The potestas of a child stops when the paterfamilias dies and he becomes sui juris. In the case of the coloni, the potestas was laid down in the census and would not stop. The transmission of the status. There was something peculiar regarding the transmission of their status. Normally, in a legitimate marriage of Romans, the children were always Romans, free citizens, and followed the hometown of their father as domicile. And sometimes also the status, like, say, in senators. The children of senators were also of senatorial status. If a union was illegitimate, for example, between a Roman citizen and a slave, children would follow, according to the jus gentium, the international law, the status libertatis of their mother, and so were either free citizens or slaves, depending on what their mother was. Enters the Senatus Consultum Claudianum, text number 6, with a small survey. This is a peculiar thing. The Senatus Consultum Claudianum was introduced under the Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 AD. There were cases of a free woman, an ingenua, the term is not irrelevant here, living with a slave. Children born out of this cohabitation would be freeborn citizens, since there was no legitimate marriage between them possible. Perhaps it was feared that this might the slave less manageable, having now freeborn children, otherwise he would not have no children at all, or disgust of such unions not befitting free women. The Senatus Consultum introduced the rule that if the woman did not leave the slave after a warning by his master, her children would follow the status of the father and be slaves too. Thus the jus gentium rule for illegitimate marriage was in this constellation reversed. The Senatus Consultum was abolished in 531-534 by Justinian, text number 7. And Justinian deals with the effects of the abolition. One effect was that the children of a colonus and a free woman in Genua would now be free from the adscriptitiate. This means that the Senatus Consultum applied before, but did not apply to the original status libertatis, but to the status of the colonate. An ingenuus, in this context, is not just a freeborn person, it was a person not subjected to the colonate. That the children would be free of the colonate was not what Justinian wanted, and he authorized the master of the colonus to recall forcibly his colonus from such marriage. He could, of course, not declare the marriage invalid in those days. It was Christian. It is impossible. Now, before the abolition, they would have followed their father's status, and after the abolition, they follow that of their mother. It seems as if the marriage is now suddenly illegitimate, but that is impossible because both are free Romans and the marriage is legitimate. One would expect the paternal status to be decisive. Evidently, the marriage was legal, children were legal, could be heir, but the transmission of the colonial status was a different matter. The marriage between coloni and so-called free persons must have been considered similar to unions between free women and slaves. In other words, the coloni were considered as on the level of slaves, although they were not slaves. And the expression used in this context for this union is conjugium non equale, an unequal marriage. It implied that it was a legitimate marriage, not a cohabitation, a contubernium, yet still between people unequal in status. Something more about the conjugium non equale, text 8. This was between an ingenua and the colonus. Now how about the reverse? Justinian says in 530 that who was born from a colona and an ingenuus, a man free from the colonate, followed, according to previous statutes, the status of his mother. Since both were Roman citizens, we would expect, again, that the children would follow the status of their father and be free from the colonate too. To follow the status of the mother makes the marriage seem to be illegitimate, but that is not. It is legitimate. The effect is caused by ancient statutes, since coloni are not slaves. Either the statute expressly said that in this case the outcome was different, or the statute introduced the conjugium non aequale with automatically this effect. What, however, was the reason to treat such marriages as conjugia non aequalia? And that in the same text at the end Justinian says it so. Both slaves and coloni are in the power of somebody else. Coloni can be released from the status like a slave by manumission by the estate owner. They have by that a deterior conditio, and on this basis the conjugium non aequale was introduced, with the effect that the rule of the jus gentium applied. Now children who would otherwise have been ingenui were coloni. The combined effect of the old statutes and the senatus consultum was that in all cases of a conjugium non aequale, the children were subjected to the colonate. It is evident that the wish to guarantee sufficient potential labor force on the land lay behind these measures. It is indeed the expressed motive behind Justinian's correction of the abolition of the senatus consultum. As to the children, they could wander away, but in the end they could be summoned by the estate owner to return and to perform services, to know the services with the colonate. And the first service was to be near or around. Now I would like to go back in time. As I said, I have now set out the situation under Justinian, and the question is now, how was it in 438 when we have the Theodosian Code? And when we go backwards in time, how was it in 319 and under Diocletian, as my scheme on number 1 shows. It was a status under Justinian, transmitted to the descendants. Was it also before, in the 4th and 5th century? When were the conjugium non aequale and the analogous application of the senatus consultum Claudianum introduced? They postulate the conditio coloniaria as already being in existence. Now the problem is that our sources for these periods are not complete, as I've shown. Some fall away, they are not taken over. Also the Theodosian Code is far from complete. So we have to fill lacunae with what we know for the years 529 and 534. And so we can reconstruct the colonnade for 438, taking care, of course, that some texts may have been changed by Justinian, and we can also, and that is the whole thing, it is like an onion, we deduct new developments which we find later on established, because then it is, we peel off the onion, so to speak. And so going back, we arrive at Diocletian, the turn of the 3rd to the 4th century. There are very few references there, but they can be embedded in what we know for later. Now in 438, and decades before, the Roman Empire was divided in 2 administrations, an eastern and a western one, each with its own emperor. In both parts of the empire, coloni were considered as subjected to a servitude, which prohibited them from entering the imperial or municipal offices. In the east, it was mostly as later under Justinian. But we see also a little bit more before 438, in the second half of the 4th century, a differentiation made between coloni of old, who are now called adscripticii, that is quite remarkable, and another kind of coloni called coloni liberi, text number 9. This status was introduced in 371 in Illyricum, after the devastations by the Goths in that province, and later in the equally visited province of Thrace. To alleviate the burden on the rural people, the capitatio humana, the poll tax, was abolished. For the coloni, the effect was that the obligation to stay on the estate was lifted, which, again, for our proving the colonate means that the colonate was accessory to the debt of the poll tax. They were now released and might migrate, and to avoid such a loss of labor, the duty to remain was kept, the obligation to work too. But in all other respects, the disadvantages of the colonate were abolished. And that furthered, of course, agriculture. Labor force was secured for the landowners. The colony were now free of potential oppression and debts on account of the poll tax, while the financial loss will have been negligible for the state. In the West, the colonate was so basically the same as later, but there are more. Here we see in the legal text that the recall of fugitive colony was since the 5th century high on the agenda. Long periods of limitation of prescription for this were set, which led, on account of marriages, to the question of determining how to deal with the offspring. An elaborate regulation on the attribution of children of colony was developed. We may relate this to the disorder in Italy and Gaul during and after the excursions of the Goths in the early 5th century, a disorder absent in the East. Many coloni will have used the opportunity to migrate elsewhere and work under better conditions or as free farmer, just as the text from Gaul shows. And almost all these laws we do not see included by Justinian, because he compiled basically for the East. Going further backwards in time, we see measures to prevent the undesired alienation of colony from their estate, probably through fiddling with the census, confirming the attachment of slaves by a trick. The Constitution refers to a similar undesired thing. And financial consequences had to be regulated. Colony, both from imperial and private estates, enlisted illegally in the imperial administration and were removed. Their status made them unfit for this. They were not ingenui. In these years, and we're now discussing the middle of the 4th century, so around 350, 360, we see in the sources the conjugium non aequale criterion applied, based on the subjected position of the colony and other groups, in order to solve the question which conditio in a mixed marriage the offspring should follow. And the combination of conjugium non aequale and the senatus consultum was extended to imperial colony and others, bound in imperial services like the mint, the monetarii, the mines, the metalari, or the purple snake divers. It presumes the existence of a conditio, and also we find, indeed, the designation conditionalis for these subjected persons. Now, I jump many specific constitutions and I go to text number 10. That is the earliest text on colony on private lands. In 332, fugitive colony were to be returned to the estate owners and the capitatio had to be paid for the period of their absence, which implies that the colony were responsible for this poll tax. They could be recalled and they stood in the power of the landowner. Next to the colonate on private land, there was the colonate on senatorial and imperial land. And these coloni were privileged. They were exempted from trade tax and superindictions, that is the extra tax. They had a special venue in litigation, the imperial administration. They did not have to do munera sordida, like cleaning sewage systems. And text number 11, there were in 325 also exempted from any office or duty in a town, which shows that they could be quite respectable people. And then in 319, text number 11, coloni of the domus of the emperor or of his res privata, his privy purse, who were able to manage an estate or to work on the land, were to be recalled. It follows that in 319, on imperial land, there existed already a colonate. So these are our earliest explicit constitutions on colony. It means that around 322 and for imperial lands around 319, the situation of coloni originales, both on imperial and private lands, was in essence the same as in 438 and later on in 534. They were tied to a piece of land, they had to return when recalled, and they had some duties, and they were subjected to the poll tax. And that leads us to the next question. What about the time before 322, 319. What about the turn of the century? Now, Justinian told us that the colonate was entered voluntarily and had to be documented as such. In origin, an agreement between estate owner and colonus, perhaps with special conditions. Since it linked to the poll tax and was laid down in the census registration, it was done as a provision for the debt for poll tax. The landowner gave an advantage or paid the tax, and the colonus rendered services under the orders of the landowner. Being obliged to stay near the estate, the agreement offered both parties an advantage. The colonus had less financial worries, the estate owner disposed of labor on demand. Such legal constructions, that is the interesting thing here, are indeed known for the middle of the 3rd century on the Appianus estates in the Fayum. From the Hieronymus archive, which had been admirably worked out by Rathbone, it appears that there was a kind of workers on the estates called metramatiaioi. They were free people who for a set period were employed on the property. Essential in the agreement was the paramone part, the promise to stay for a definite period on the property. They too were included in the property accounts, receiving advances and money. Now, the paramone construction is already known in the 1st century AD. See text 12, with the essentials of it. As Hengstel in his fundamental study underlines, the duty to remain on the estate was secondary. The characterizing element of the paramone was that the paramonarios owed a debt, either for a sum paid out or for a credit, and that he promised to be at the service of the creditor and do what the creditor ordered him to do, instead of paying interest. It's a case of antichresis, therefore. It's an antichresis agreement. It implied that he stayed where the creditor stayed. Otherwise, you cannot do what he orders you to do, around or in his house, not to move away. Sometimes, as Rathbone shows, with the express obligation to stay day and night at his disposal. He would receive some loan for his services, coupled sometimes with food or the like, and the creditor could also agree to pay taxes for him. Rathbone mentions that the landowner steward paid the taxes and organized the performance of public duties. The sum had to be paid off in order to end the paramone, and if that did not happen, the situation would continue forever. Prematurely, it could only be ended by a formal release, a dialysis. We think of the manumissio under Justinian. Only the paramonarios could repay the debt, but others might be in the agreement as well and be liable too. An agreement may contain the word paramone, but does not have to have so, as long as the distinguishing elements as set out in text 12 are present. Although Rathbone mentioned in 2 examples the debt, this aspect is further neglected by him. He and Sirks focus on the paramenein part, the verb, but as Hengstel set out, the essential in the paramone is the mention of the paramone sum, the debt of the paramonarios, and the antichresis. Paramenein cannot be the decisive element because, as Hengstel says, to stay somewhere is an obligation inherent in several agreements. For example, in a labor contract you have to be there, or in a nursing contract you shouldn't go on voyage. The position of a paramonarius may seem deplorable, but for people without any means of subsistence, it was not so bad an arrangement, because on subsistence level, they were at least secured by the paramone against the fiscal claim and further needs by the credit, as Rathbone also emphasizes. Hengstel underlines that the paramone should be differentiated from credit in general. Now, the next question, how did the paramone become public law? Because this is still, it looks very similar to the colonate, but it's still private law. And it doesn't have to be restricted to Egypt. Similar agreements may have existed elsewhere. Well, one ingredient is still missing, the census, and it is about the role of the census I'm going to speak now. The census had originally 3 functions: to ascertain who were liable for the army, to establish the wealth of each citizen, and to ascertain status, class, and rank. After 212 AD, its main function was now as tax register. As such, it acquired also the function of ownership register. Then The idea is who pay taxes will most likely be owner. And this is expressly mentioned also for the donation of slaves and land in already 290 AD. An estate owner had to register in the declaration for his estate, next to his land, his animals and slaves, for the poll tax owed by him for them. We know he registered Coloni too. Now, if the paramonnaie included the payment of the capitatio humana of the poll tax, an extract, not scriptitio, apographos, was apparently inserted in the census, and by that the coloni registered. And by that the estate owner would either pay for them or guarantee their payment. By the agreement the coloni, including wife and children, were already in private law under the orders of the landowner. The fact that the colonus had obliged himself to stay near or on the estate was in private law enforceable. But the registration of this obligation in the census and the fact that he or the landowner would pay his tax on the estate and his duty to stay close must have sufficed to make the estate his domicile, his origo. Then taxes were assessed and levied in one's domicile. The statutes which introduced the conjugium non aequale and the application of the senatus consultum presumed the existence of or created simultaneously a deterior conditio, a legal concept already known by the time. Was the private law obligation to perform the services the landowner could ask sufficient to make the colonus a subjected person in public law? Does not seem to be probable. But could the census registration have affected this? Had the census still the capacity to define status? That is not quite possible. But it had acquired the function of establishing ownership. And although registered coloni were not property, it is not impossible that the registration was interpreted as establishing, similar to an adjudication, a power over them, less than ownership, similar to that over persons in mancipio, who were also free, yet in the potestas of the creditor. And, we should not forget, the landowner was a creditor. And this fits expressions later used. And if these suggestions do not suffice, we must assume that among the mentioned previous statutes of Justinian, there was one which formalized this in public law. Perhaps this transition had already taken place before 320 AD. The coloni remained owner of their property. Their debt towards the landowner and obligation to pay did not make their property pledged, unless, of course, they had agreed to this. But if they were considered to be in the potestas of their estate owner, it could be treated as if peculium, and by that it created, to a certain extent, a preferential claim for the estate owner. And that too would fit the already existing claim of the estate owner as creditor for the assets of his debtor. The census, the catalysator of the colonate, if we have to look for an origin of the colonate, it is in the state census registration of paramonarioi for the poll tax. It did not make landlords in general liable for the tax of the lessees, that is one theory on the colonate, because it would only apply to paramonnaie agreements, which included the poll tax. So it reduces very much the extent of the colonate. Nor did it make landlords tax collectors of their underlings. That's another theory of the colonate. It was possible for the colonate to pay it himself to the tax collectors. For the fisc, the registration in the census sufficed. It may have been that Diocletian suggested this registration to stabilize the tax levy. Better to have the landlords also formally answerable than on a voluntary basis. When this would have happened is uncertain. Anyway, with the use of the census, the paramonnaie moved out of the realm of private law and entered into that of public law. The census registration was primarily meant to establish the value of the state, with all its accessories, and had acquired a function as proof of ownership. New owners had to take over the census assessment. As we may assume, estate accounts, including paramonnaie agreements, were connected with the estate, and not with the person of the owner. Both factors will have made the colony bound and subjected to new owners. The census assessment was not easily readjusted, notwithstanding the intention to revise it every 15 years. And these factors may have caused it to go bad for the colony. It made the colonus, as it is later said, a servus terrae, a slave of the land, that is, not a servus alicuius, somebody's slave. Further, the census made the estate their origo, their domicile, being registered for the poll tax on it, hence the term originalis. A constitution of the year 293-294 by Diocletian introduced the rule that nobody could change his origo at his own will, text number 15. In other words, one needed official permission. We do not know exactly why he ruled this, but it would have served the assessment and levying of taxes and liturgies, since the domicile was the basis here, and this may have been the motives. Being registered as such, and the subjected status being tied to the person of the estate owner, the census registration may have been considered as establishing their status a conditio. And regarding this, the Lex Romana Burgundionum 14:6, text number 14, says that coloni may not alienate anything of their peculium without consent of their master. It refers to this to a constitution by Diocletian and Maximinian, thus to a constitution of the year 293-294. And as I said already before, with CSI and the hand, it implies that the colonus was under the potestas of his landowner, an essential element of the colonate. This element remains meaningless without the context of the colonate as related before. Other evidence for this year lacks. It may have been present in the lost Hermogenean code, yet combined this text combined with the survey for 332 and 319, which evidenced the colonate of 438 as already existing in the second decade of the 4th century in a sense, it suffices to fill the lacuna in information. It justifies to assume that already in 293-294, the colonate existed basically in its form of 438. With people with Paramount agreements, including the poll tax, the registration in the census fixed both their domicile and their subjection to the estate owner in public law, and their lesser status. Then, abolition of the poll tax implied release from the registration in the estate census from the domicile and from the authority of the estate owner, as we see in 371 in the Lyricum. And it means also that the deterior conditio is lifted from them, hence the expression free coloni, coloni liberi. When the tetrarchy was created in 293, it began reforms which required more state revenues. First, the tax levy was improved. The introduction of the census registration of Paramonai regarding the poll tax would fit this, creating so the colonate as we know. To assume that the colonate in its legal form with coloni censibus adscripti came into being in or shortly before 293-294 will not be amiss. Thank you.